In the glass of that boardroom insert, with the city blinking cold and bright beyond the panes, I learned that a vow can be a weapon when the other hand holds it steady for a larger plan. And I stood there already knowing I would not be the same woman again. I am Helena Montez, 35 years old, a senior bank executive who has learned to measure power in numbers as easily as I measure the miles on a red-eye flight. And I have carried a hidden ambition in the quiet room of my chest for years. The dream that someday the room would bend to a different kind of leader, a woman who can turn risk into opportunity without losing her own voice in the process. The personal thing that frames this episode began long before any quarterly report arrived in a sleeve of blue. A relationship built on late dinners and bright plans. A marriage that looked like a partnership and sounded like a shared future. The kind of partnership people envy because it seems as solid as a steel beam in a rising tower. We said yes to love with the same breath we used to sign a new term sheet. We spoke in softened tones about trust and teamwork. And I believed in him the way a city believes in a rising sun, certain that the day would prove us right. But ambition moves like a tide, and love, when it arrives in the form of a charming companion who shares your calendar and your secrets, can become accomplice to the very plans you keep safe in your files. He learned my cadence, the way I listen for leverage in a room, the way I can calm a tense room with a single phrase that lands like a settlement on an old grievance. And I learned to trust him in moments when trust should have been reserved for the scoreboard and the legal papers that bind us all to the edge of risk. It did not take long for the first whispers to slip through the doors of our life, the little lies that hide behind compliments, the swift words that flirt with the line between affection and control. The way he would step into a meeting not to contribute, but to suggest someone else's idea as if it were mine. Then claim the victory as though it belonged to him from the start. I began to notice the small things at first, tokens of a hidden ledger, a confidential email that was never meant for my eyes, a smile that vanished as soon as I walked in the room, a late-night call that sounded more like a confession than a check-in. I told myself these were misreads, that a man who loves you would not weaponize your trust, that a partnership could not be bankrupted by petty fear. But fear does not always arrive loudly. Sometimes it walks in with the grace of a polite lie and sits down at your table with a glass of your own wine and asks you to pretend the toast never happened. The season that followed was the season of real tests, the kind that do not ask for mercy and do not offer a safety net. He seemed to believe that his access to the inside of my life equaled a veto on my plans, that the marriage itself could become a kind of shield for his own insecurities. I caught him in moments of quiet, listening to the sound of my own voice deliver a strategy that would give women a clearer ladder to the top of the pyramid. And I heard him murmur agreement with a different intention, an agreement about timing, about the moment when he would step forward and claim the credit I had earned with years of blood and breath. My colleagues began to look at me with a new respect, and I could feel the shift of the wind in the room, the way the air grew lighter when I walked in, the way a room remembers the name before the person speaks it. Yet the more I rose, the more I saw the shadow behind me. The long shadow of a man who believed that our union should carry his name more than mine, that my success was a platform for his own grand theater. The turning point arrived on a morning when the market did something cruel, and the room smelled of coffee and fear. When the numbers looked slippery, and the plan we had built a year to push through suddenly seemed too clean, too pure for a world that enjoys the gray areas where wealth accrues without accountability. He was there, with his practiced smile and the ease of a man who can pivot a story to fit his needs. And when I stood to present the new structure, my structure, the one I had written with the quiet hours that left me with cold hands and a bright mind, I saw him lean forward, as if to lend me support, and instead, he offered a line that would bend the entire narrative toward his benefit. The room listened. Not out of loyalty, but out of shared hope that a new era would be kinder to the people who believed in it. And then I saw it, an admission in the glint of his eye, a small but undeniable signal that he would not let this be mine alone, that the personal life behind the professional success could be weaponized to force a settlement of old debts. I did not flinch when the moment came, though the world paused with the breath of a held note. I asked for the floor, not to defend a proposal, but to speak to the truth that had walked in with him and never left. I spoke of a bond that had shifted into a ledger of power and appetite, of a promise that had become a means to control rather than to sustain. And I laid out the proof as plainly as a balance sheet. The monks of shared confidences that were never equally shared, the subscriptions to a private project funded by the very assets I had forged a plan to protect, the signatures that did not match the person who stood beside me in the room. I spoke of the moment I realized that a wedding ring can be nothing more than a silvery thread that binds your hands to a plan not your own. And then I did the unthinkable in the most careful way possible, a move that was as much a legal act as a moral one, a declaration that I would not carry this burden any longer, that the marriage would not be a shield any longer, that I would take back my name and my future with the same clarity with which I take back a portfolio after a storm. I did not raise my voice, but I did not lower it either. I spoke with the measured calm of someone who has spent years studying markets and the human heart alike. And when the words left me, they fell like precise steps on a stage. In that moment, the boardroom changed its weather. The chests of the men and women around the table rose and fell with the rhythm of truth spoken aloud. And I could hear the soft click of a bottle being capped somewhere behind me as the room decided that the time had come to separate the personal from the professional, to separate his need for control from my need for control of my own life. The divorce became a formal act in a place where I had once believed only figures and forecasts mattered. And I watched him realize that the shield he had built with my trust now became the blade that severed him from the life he had imagined. The papers moved like a river in motion, and I stood there with the calm of a captain who knows the ship will not founder when the storm hits, because the hull was built to withstand the worst. The announcement did not scream in the room. It whispered in the ears of the directors as I declared that I would take charge of my own future, that the assets I commanded would be stewarded with a new purpose, that a portion of the holdings would fund scholarships for young women who believed their first thought could be a bold one. It was not a beautiful exit, but it was a clean one, and the coldness of justice was a glow that warmed me from within rather than burned me from without. The price of the moment was not small, the personal cost, the whispered rumors, the long nights of loneliness that followed the applause. But the price of the future was a price I was willing to pay for the chance to build something that would outlast us both. When the gavel finally fell, the room exhaled as if it had been holding its breath for years, and I stood with a steady hand that did not betray how much I had learned to endure, how much I had learned to forgive without surrendering the core of who I am. The night after, I walked the river streets with a wind that felt as if it had been carved from 1,000 pages of annual reports, tasting the air in a way that felt new and old at the same time. The taste of victory and the sting of the cost. I thought of the dream I had carried through the long hours, of the belief that a woman could steer not just a department, but an entire industry toward a kinder form of power, one where responsibility and ambition walk together rather than at odds. The road ahead would be heavy with the work of healing and rebuilding, with the discipline of watching every move, and the courage to turn away a shortcut if it risks anyone who could follow me, especially the young women who look to me as a map and a mirror. Yet there in the quiet after the storm, I felt the true justice take form, not as a loud triumph, but as a steady, patient, precise reclaiming of my life and my work. A promise to myself that this new chapter would be my own, free from the shadow, and that my voice would finally be the loudest thing in the room when the next decision stood between fear and future. I left the building with the city's pulse still in my throat and a new blueprint burning in my mind, and I knew then that I would keep climbing, not to prove him wrong, but to prove to every girl with a dream that a woman in power does not need a man's permission to redefine what is possible, that justice can come in a form that does not scorch the earth, but steadies it, and that revenge, when true, is not a scream, but a plan that finally lands.